Hey, in this lecture you learn about loops, and loops are very important. They are one of the fundamental building blocks of the Python programming language and of every other programming language as well, because loops are crucial. So what are loops? Well, loops are basically a way that allow you to execute a statement multiple times. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a bunch of files, text files, and you want to insert a certain string inside each of these text files. So you'd have to open those text files in Python by writing the Python code that corresponds to opening a file, and then you'd insert that string inside the file and close the file and save it. So there is some code that does this opening and inserting the text and closing the file. And if you had 100 files, you'd have to execute that code 100 times. So you'd come up with, let's say, 100 lines of code. But that doesn't sound very efficient. So that's what loops are for. So a productive way to solve the problem that I just mentioned would be to create a list of these files, so a Python list of the file names, and then you would use a loop to iterate through this list of file names. And a loop would do all that in just a few lines of code. And there are two kinds of loops in Python. There is the for loop, and the example that I just mentioned would be solved using a for loop. And we also have the while loop. A while loop does also repeatedly execute a statement that you write, and it executes it as long as a given condition is true. So let's say you have a user that is trying to log in your web app, and while he keeps entering the wrong password, you'd continue executing a statement that would reject his login into your system. So while the password is wrong, reject the user, something like that. So that's about the definition of the for loop and the while loop. In the next lecture I'll show you the syntax of the for loop, and by also looking at an example. So see you in the next lecture. Good. Now you know the definition of a loop, and you know that we have for loops and while loops in Python. And in this lecture you will learn how to write for loops. Now a for loop normally iterates through a list of objects and applies some methods or some functions or some operations over each of these objects. The array that the for loop iterates through is not necessarily a list. It can be a tuple, sometimes it can be a dictionary, it can even be a string. So every object that is made of other simpler objects. So let's create a list first. Let's say emails is a list of 3 emails, 3 email addresses. So let's write some fake email addresses here. me@gmail.com, you@hotmail.com, and they@gmail.com. Now let's say you want to apply the print function to each item of this list. And the stupid way to do this would be to print out every item one by one. Let's say the first item, which has an index of 0, and then you do the same for emails with index of 1, and so on and so on. That's definitely not how we want to do it. So to print out these 3 items we use a for loop, and for loop always starts with the for keyword, and then you pick a variable, let's say email. So don't confuse the email variable with the emails variable, these are totally different. And for email in emails, so here you pass a variable that holds the list you want to iterate through, and press enter, and as you see here we got the indentation. So the line that follows the first line of the loop is always indented. So that means this line here that we will write belongs to this loop. So it's part of this block. And here is where we write the action, the statement we want to execute multiple times. So we want to print the email. So that is very straightforward and very clean and very readable. And let's execute this first before I explain it to you better. Save the script first and execute. And this is script 4. So we got the 3 items printed out on the screen. And I obviously got an @ wrong here, no problem. So what the code does is that you say for each item in the list emails, print out the item. And of course you can use every variable that you like, if this is more readable for you. So for each item in the emails list, print out the item. Great. Let's do something more fancy here. I'll delete this line of code. And now I'd like to print out only the emails that have a Gmail address associated with them. So I don't want to print out any other item rather than the Gmail ones. So that means we want Python to make a decision. If it finds Gmail in the item, in the string, it will print it out. If it doesn't find it, will not print it out. So we want to use a conditional here, and that would be an if statement. So again, we say for each item in the list, if the string Gmail is in item, print out the item. So I'm sure this was easier than you were expecting. Let's save, Ctrl S, and execute. So we got only the Gmail accounts printed out. So again, we are saying for item in emails, and when we do this, Python grabs the first item of the list. So the first iteration is about the first item, and this item is temporarily stored in the variable item. Then while this value is stored in this variable, Python checks if the string Gmail is in that variable. So with the first item this is true, and that's why Python prints out the item. So it prints out me@gmail.com. Then it goes to the next item. If Gmail is in that item, it prints out the item. In this case, Gmail is not there, so it doesn't do anything, and it goes to the next item. So that's why we call it a loop. So the loop goes in and out, until the list is exhausted. So when it goes to the third item, to the last item of the list, the loop ends, and the output is generated, like here. And don't forget about indentation, so be careful and look here that we indent it under the for loop, and again we indent it under the if statement, because this indentation here is part of the if block, and this one here is part of the for loop block. So very readable code, and I believe very fun to write. I'll see you in the next lecture. Okay, before explaining the while loop, I'd like to introduce you user input. User input is a feature that allows your script to interact with the user. And with interaction, I mean when the user executes the script, so like when we call the script here, the script will ask the user to enter some input. Let's say they will enter a number, and the script will get this number and will process it, will do some operations depending on what we have written inside the script, and then it will return some result back to the user. And the user input feature is implemented through the input function. As simple as this, input, and here you can write some message that will be shown to the user. Let's say, what planet are you from? Just like that. Save the script and then go to your command line and execute. So this is script 6. And the program is asking us to enter some input. Let's say Earth. That's it. Here nothing happened, because we didn't do any other thing here rather than just asking the user to input some value. So let's do something with that value. But first of all, we need to store that value inside a variable. That would be a good practice. Let's say planet equals to the value that the user will input. So the planet will get the value that the user will enter here. Then we can do something with that value. Let's say we want to print that value. Planet. That's it. So let's execute again. Mars this time. So the program prints out Mars. Okay, printing is good, but let's go a bit more advanced than that. So I'll go to my script 2, and what I have here is a function. Let me delete this. So we had the function here, which we wrote before in the course, And this function gets the currency rate as input and the amount of euros which you want to convert to dollars. So the function then calculates the dollars given the euros and the rate, and it returns the dollars. What we will do now is get a value for the rate and a value for euros from the user. So we will get those values here, and then we will execute the function given those values. For that we need two inputs here. Let's say r as a variable, input, enter rate. And once more, enter euros. And this would be E. And then these values would go here. So R for the rate and E for the euros. So we execute the script. Python reads the function definition. Then it asks the user to enter the rate. The user enters the rate. Then the script goes on. Python asks the user to enter the euros. The user enters the euros. And then those values are passed to the currency converter function. Now I expect to get an error here, but I still want to execute it so that you see what error you'll get, and that's how you understand things better. So let's execute script number 2. This is not the error I was talking about. This is because I forgot to save the script. So let me execute it again. And so we are now asked to enter the rate. Let's say 100. And euros, let's say 3 euros. Why not? And here is the error I was talking about. And Python is basically saying that it cannot multiply strings. Why is that? Well, that is because when the user enters the numbers here, as we did, the input function reads those values as strings. So it doesn't immediately read them as numbers, as we would probably expect. But there is a solution to that. Once we get those strings here in the R and the E variable, we could convert them to a float. We would want to apply the float function to each of these variables. So before these values would be passed to the currency converter function for execution, the values of these variables would first be converted to a float data type. And lastly, we would want to print out the output that this function generates. And that's it. Click Save, and then go to the command line. And script 2, enter the rate, let's say 4 euros, 100 this time, and so we get 400. So that was how you can make your script interactive, so that the script can get the user input, process it, and then returns an output. In the next lecture, I'll be incorporating the user input function while teaching you the while loop. So I'll see you in the next lecture. While loops now. You already learned about for loops, and we were able to execute the print statement multiple times using a for loop. For loops are used much more often than while loops, but while loops also have their area of application sometimes. And in this lecture I'll write a very small program that will demonstrate the syntax of a while loop. So let's start. A while loop starts with the while keyword. Let's say we want to write a program that will compare a password against the value that the user enters. And while the password entered by the user is not the same with the password that we know, the loop will keep occurring over and over again until the user enters the correct password. So while the password is different from, let's say the real password is Python123, and we need a colon there. And notice here that these two symbols mean is not. And here we are comparing a variable to a value. But we don't have a variable yet declared. So first we need to declare the variable here. Password equals to an empty string. So that's the initial value before the user enters their own value. And here we want to get the user value. And here we want to store the value entered by the user in our password variable. So input, enter password. Now, once we get the value in our password variable, we want to compare that variable. And we compare it against the real password. So Python 123. So if the value entered by the user is equal to Python 123, we want to print out the string "you are logged in." Else, so if value is to false, we would have another action here. And that would be "sorry, try again." That's it. Let's test this now before I go over the code again and explain things better to you. So save and then go to your command line. That's the script number 6. So let's try a wrong password here. Let's say just Python. Sorry, try again. We try again. Python 1, no. Python 123. And you are logged in. So we are just printing out some lines here, some text. But in a real life situation where we would be expecting real user logins, we would have to write some longer code here that basically would show the user the internal pages of your website, of your web application. So you would unlock your user content of your website. So again, what we have here, while password is not equal to 1 to 3, this block of code will be executed over and over again. Once the value gets equal to Python 123, the loop stops running, and so does the script. So I believe this is a very nice explanation and example for you to understand the while loop. Again, you'll be using the for loop much more than the while loop, but this is good to know, and it was also good practice for you, I believe. See you in the next lecture. Alright, you learn how to use a for loop to iterate through a list. Sometimes though, you might have to iterate through 2 lists at the same time. Let's say you have 2 lists. A list with 3 items where you have some names. Let's say James, John, and Jack. Pretty creative here. And you also have another list. Let's say email, domains, which also has 3 items. It has Gmail, Hotmail, and Yahoo. If you'd like to apply the same operation to the items of both lists, you'd use the for loop in a slightly different way. So everything starts with the for keyword, and here you'd have to pass 2 variables. Let's say the variable I and the variable j. So for I, j in, and you'd use the zip function here. And there is where you put the names of your lists. Email domains. That's it. And here is where you write your actions, your operations, what you want to do with the variable I and j. Let's try to print them out first before we do something more creative. So this is how you print 2 variables at the same time. Click save. Go to your command line. This is script 7. And so you get both the item of the first list and the item of the second list. So that's how you use the for loop for iterating in more than one list. So let's move on.